I'm going to start by not saying too much. I want to show you some images which you will instantly recognize, at least for people who have been around for the past decade or 20 years. So this was, well, the pictures you saw from March 2011. So after the nuclear power plant disaster in Fukushima in Japan, it was not just a nuclear power plant disaster, you say. It was also, there was an earthquake, there was a tsunami, as you know. So it was a triple disaster which took place in Japan at the time, much to the surprise of many. And this then is a datification of the nuclear power plant catastrophe. So what you see here is the red spot, the hot spot in the middle, which is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, the zone, in fact. And what you see is, you know, red is bad, yellow is bad, and so on, right? You go to blue and to white. But these are data that were generated through the Japanese Speedy network. I always forget what the acronym stands for, so I have my cheat sheet. It stands for System for Prediction of Environmental Emergency Dose Information. So what it does is it divides the country into a grid, and you have monitoring stations all across Japan, right? It's heavily monitored. So what this system does is it predicts the spread of radioactive material across the nation. It has been set up specifically for this type of purpose, right? And so this is taken from the Japanese government, the central government, and then that's a prediction model. This is actual measurements taken by the DOE, so the Department of Energy, because the Japanese government collaborates with the US government on many issues. And what the DOE did shortly after the disaster, the catastrophe, is they flew over the zone, right? And so you see that these two may sort of align. You see something similar, but this is aerial monitoring in real time, right? I'm not going to go in too much detail anymore, like as far as the data are concerned, the technicalities of it. But what is interesting from my perspective, looking at this, is these data were not shared publicly. So the Japanese central government did share these sensitive data with the US government. But none of this was actually made public until March 23rd. So that's about 2 weeks, or almost 2 weeks after the nuclear disaster, after it became very clear that there was a serious problem going on in Fukushima. And so I mentioned this because this caused a public outrage in Japan. Citizens complained that they were not getting the right data from the right sources. And some academics or scientists even claimed in the news media that they were not permitted, or they were actually being instructed by officials to cover up the data, to not share the data with the Japanese public. And so this is where I want to focus on a response, a citizen-led response, something we in the West would call citizen science. But having been to Japan many times, I think the term is not accurate. So there's not all that many groups in Japan who would consider themselves to be citizen science groups, but I'll get back to that later. Like, we would probably look at it as being citizen science, emerging from the grassroots, from the local communities. And what these groups did was there was this urgent need to get actionable and reliable radiation data in the country. There was simply not enough information, and they wanted answers to basic questions. Where can I go? Which area should I avoid? Which food is contaminated? What is safe to eat, and so on. And of course, specifically in the Fukushima region or prefecture, but also outside of that area. And so one such initiative that emerged, you may have heard of it, is Safecast, which is, by the way, not a local Japanese initiative. It's more international, you could say, because it's mostly Americans living in Japan. But they mobilized resources, all the know-how they had, and they began measuring around Fukushima and the rest of Japan using their own do-it-yourself technologies, their own open data source ethics, and so on. So there's this whole ethos around it. Yes, as I mentioned, there's more than Safecast. I'll come back to that. But so it started out really low key and low tech, if you like. They were using duct tape and these really big, chunky devices, even a laptop, but they were going to places just to get a sense of the data, like the radiation, or the levels of radiation pollution and how the radiation was spreading. And they've refined this, and they've refined their systems, their data, their approach. But they needed reliable, actionable data in that instance, right? And it was not being provided. So there's this information void which citizens then jumped into. And as I mentioned, because of a breach of public trust in formal science and policy, so you have this strong cleavage in Japan between, let's say, the formal institutions with government, but also certain scientists, experts, TEPCO, which is the company that runs the Fukushima nuclear power plants. So those actors on one side, and then on the other, citizen groups. And it taps into a longer tradition of civic movements in Japan. And then, just to be very clear about this, I won't go into this, but this is taken from my PhD student, Yoka Kienens, who's done a lot of research in Japan. And she's listed, she's actually interviewed many of the citizen scientists, as we call them, in the rural areas and in some of the cities, right? So you look at them, there's just a lot of them scattered all over Japan, and they're still active today. Not all of them are, but many of them are. And so they're actually called citizen radiation monitoring organizations. That's the term they use instead of citizen science. I'll come back to that as well. But so if we think of it as citizen science, they would say it's not. It's shimin kagaku is the term they use, right? But you can ask, what kind of citizen science or what kind of movement are we dealing with? And a question being asked in Japan is, what is science for, right? Is it for, with, or by citizens, right? Is it for society? Is it with society? What is it about? And so here we see a very, in a way, a very specific form, because it emerges from the bottom up, right? It's driven by local concerns and needs, and in response to a disaster, right? Which is not necessarily how citizen science initiatives emerge. Although there is a longer tradition of citizen engagement with science in Japan, which goes back to Chernobyl, among other things. But so it's important to focus on, or to say this, that it's about the need that arises as these citizens practice science by citizens, because its purpose is to be science for, or rather, yes, to be science for citizens, right? And so issues spark a public into being. That's a line taken from Noortje Maris, a scholar in the field of STS, so science and technology studies. I think she's absolutely right. This big issue, this big catastrophe sparked public into being, created a political situation which the Japanese central government still struggles to contain in a way, or to control. And then I also included a quotation of, or citation of Harold Macmillan, so former UK Prime Minister. When he was asked what he was worried about as a statesman, he said, events, right? These dictate the course of history, big events, big disasters, and there's absolutely no way to control those events, although you can, of course, have contingency plans, and you can practice this, right? For, it's called emergency preparedness, crisis response. There are ways of anticipating future catastrophes. All right, and now we're taking the airplane. So I was thinking, because we're moving from Japan to where I'm from Belgium. And what we see here in Europe is perhaps a different ecology of civic engagement with science and technology. This is just an example taken from the city of Antwerp, where it all started very low key in a way, so very bottom up as well, because this is what I'm looking at, the more bottom up grassroots driven citizen science approaches. It's also very urban, right? It's about measuring air pollution in the cities, in this case, in the city of Antwerp. And so you have these local initiatives emerging in Flanders, which is the Dutch northern, the northern part of Belgium, so the Dutch-speaking part of it. And perhaps you've heard of this campaign, so the Curieuze Neuzen, it means curious noses, but what it stands for, or what it represents, is actually citizens measuring nitrogen dioxide in their environment, so in cities across the whole of Flanders. And it's been massively successful. So it's being, the spin-offs being created. There's been policy uptake of this. The data have been taken seriously. And you even have people in Flanders moving to the seaside because they've figured out, or they've understood that the place where they live is just too polluted, right? So it had a big impact. And there were more than 20,000, no, actually 20,000 participants across the whole region taking place. So this was not easy. It was a process of many years, but it has become, in a way, it is scaled up, right? It has become mainstream and accepted, in contrast to Japan. So I'll draw that contrast in a moment. And then, as you all know, at the European level, everyone is crazy about citizen science, right? But they have a particular, I think policymakers have a particular take on it. They're not necessarily referring to these local initiatives, grassroots projects. They're thinking more contributory citizen science, where scientists set the agenda, have citizens measure data, return those data to the lab, or these could be more broadly collaborative projects, but not necessarily the bottom-up citizen-driven ones. But as you know, it's an official policy now, so it's described in the whole open science, open innovation agenda. Just to give you that context. But so the question is, what does this mean for urban governance and digital citizenship? I mean, coming back to the main topic or the theme of this workshop. So if we compare the two, and they are obviously not always easy to compare, but I think it's instructive to do this nonetheless, right? If you look at the Flemish Curious Noses project, so with thousands of citizens measuring nitrogen dioxide, generating an enormous interest, hundreds of spin-offs, you know, leading to new air pollution policies in cities such as low emission zones, right? If you compare that with the impact in Japan, in another field, in another culture, nonetheless, the two have had some kind of societal impact, kind of policy impact, and some kind of scientific impact. So this is taken, the article on the right is taken from National Geographic, but what the authors are arguing there is that the sensors installed in people's neighborhoods in Japan did have an effect, right? So there was actually collaboration going on between these local communities and local governments, but not with the central Japanese government, and there still isn't. That's a very, very tight, difficult, or tense relationship. And it actually forced the central government in Japan to do more than the spot checking. So what you have with the Speedy network, for instance, and other measuring stations and monitoring stations is they're fixed, and they're just in very specific places scattered around the country, but they're not fine-grained enough. This was a criticism coming from citizens, because ultimately, if, like, let's say a mother or father takes their kids to school, they want to know if the kid can play in the sand, right, in the playground. They want questions of very specific local needs. So the central government has actually has begun doing that. They're doing mobile measurements across the country rather than just using the fixed ones, right? At least that's the claim being made in this article in National Geographic. But so there's some kind of impact. I could go on about this because this is not an exhaustive list. But so just to compare, like, this is where I would like to refer to agonistic learning, in the sense that what we see, and this is a point Sachit raised in his presentation, is that in Europe, there seems to be this willingness on behalf of the formal institutions, such as public authorities, but also credentialed scientists and so on, to engage with citizen science, to embrace it. And also, of course, it's being dictated by instances or institutes such as the European Commission. Whereas in Japan, this is not the case, I would say, in any way. It's certainly not a formal policy. Citizen science is a contested practice, and so is citizenship. So in the nuclear area specifically, citizenship has these has this connotation of being anti-government, being anti-nuclear, going against the established order, and that does not resonate well, I'd say, with Japanese policy culture. Right? And so, drawing on the work of Chantal Mouffe, I would classify this as on the left we see this more agonistic relationship between different stakeholders, where there are competing interests and goals and motivations at play, but somehow they are finding ways to make that productive or generative. That doesn't mean there's necessarily coalitions or alignments taking place, but I think it can be generative. because in one way or another, the stakeholders are forced to listen to each other. In Japan, it seems to be almost antagonistic in the sense that you're working with dissidents, right? So on the left, you have opposition, where you are working with let's say a policy or political rationality, which everyone is willing to accept more or less, the rules of the game. In Japan, these rules themselves are being questioned, right? And so that's why I would think, that's how I perceive it, like citizen science in Japan is more, it takes on the role of a watchdog, right? Speaking back to power, formal power, right? And here in Europe, and overly, I realize this is a big generalization, but there seems to be this openness, this creation of a space for more collaborative forms of citizen engagement with science and technology. Okay, and so that's not to say that, coming back to Japan, actually, many of these initiatives did have some kind of international impact, especially Safecast, because Safecast is run by an international group of people, so including the Americans I mentioned earlier. There's also one Dutch person involved, but they have strong networks, they have resources, they're very data savvy, very tech savvy, and they were invited at one point to present their work at the IAEA, so the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. And a report that was produced, was generated by the IAEA after this meeting, stated this, right? So for governments, authorities and agencies, crowdsourcing certainly is the genie that will not go back in the bottle. It is necessary to accept that this technology is here to stay and that empowerment of the public is not necessarily a negative development. It's interesting, that framing, right? How that sort of shifts the dominant mindset, especially in a very closed world, which, the nuclear world is fairly closed. And so other organizations or institutions across the world are actually tentatively reaching out to these citizen science communities. And they're interested, at the very least, in the types of approaches these citizens are mobilizing, the types of data they're generating, and there might be even a possibility of collaborating. At the very least, they're on speaking terms, which is not the situation in Japan necessarily. This is a picture taken here, the big one, of a Safecast representative who's invited as a non-state actor to Vienna, to the IAEA, where he was asked by members of the international community to explain the work of Safecast. So how are they using their devices? What are they measuring? What is their purpose, and so on? And he told me that it was extremely, like, it was probably the most difficult presentation he ever gave, because they were just firing questions at him, very technical, very difficult questions. But he said that at one point, the atmosphere actually shifted when a Norwegian delegate said, we have to take this seriously. We have to listen to what these citizen scientists are doing, what they're accomplishing, because they obviously speak to a certain need in society, which we fail as formal institutions, which we just fail to pick up or notice. And so it's interesting that he was invited in the first place, but then that this came out of it is I would say, is quite empowering. Okay, and so another line from the same report. Interestingly, it's still a draft report, although it was published in 2014. But the public is no longer prepared to sit idly by. If their needs are not being met, they simply go out and organize things themselves, right? And there was an article that appeared in Nature on this issue. But also turning to the literature, a more assertive public also produces more contention and conflict, and it may question existing democratic institutions and require reforms to update them to meet contemporary needs. So I think these are empirical examples that really speak to this, to what's being said here, right? For this, I apologize. I am a sociologist of science, so this might be a bit, I'm going to introduce some jargon, but this is what I'm thinking about, or have been thinking about lately, is how to make sense of these processes. And so we all use the term, or many of us, at least in sociology, we use the term institutionalization. And this is a conventional definition, you could say. So the process by which beliefs, norms, roles, values, etc., forms of behavior are embedded in an organization, a social system, or a society as a whole, right? So something is becoming established, is being incorporated, is entering formal institutions, right? And that is often how it is made sense of. Also, when you think of scaling up or mainstreaming certain things or social realities, right? Or instruments or data, whatever, what have you. Things are being taken up, so they travel from the bottom to the top, right? And so I think in this case, just giving you the examples of Safecast Japan, but also Curious Noses in Flanders, I think this is clearly happening. There is that uptake in formal institutional policy, for instance, right? But at the same time, I think we should be attentive to what, you know, the other movement, the movement from the top down, because what many of these groups also do is they accommodate institutions. So both Safecast and Curious Noses, they use scientific protocols, scientifically validated methods. It's all about scientific credibility. Their data are calibrated, etc. So they're very strict on what counts as data in a very conventional sense. You could contrast this with some citizen sensing initiatives, for instance, where people use their nose or their eyes, and you know they're using very low tech, like just pencil and paper to document, let's say, pollution, right, noise pollution, so on. This is very, well, yes, it is high tech. It's at least very scientific, or it's meant to be. And so when we think of institutionalization, I think we should also consider how the local groups are accommodating mainstream science, for instance, right? Mainstream rules, norms, behaviors. And this is precisely what makes them successful. This is why they last way beyond one event such as the Fukushima disaster. And they've reached middle ground. So you could argue they're middle up or middle down, what have you. But this is where I think the real potential lies for transformation. So this is where I think we should be paying attention to. And the second point I want to make is that the conflicts between the above and the below, because I think they're obviously conflicts, they're antagonisms, I would consider those to also be a form of co-creation, right? So co-creation is not always harmonious and nice and polite and respectful. It's also a clash, and it can be a very violent clash of conflicts, of interests, of values. And if we pay attention to this the right way, if we appreciate them as opportunities for learning, for agonistic learning, I think we would broaden our repertoire. We would see more solutions emerging, right? And so we want to continuously adjust through collaboration. The whole idea of the co-creation agenda pushed by, for instance, the EC and other nations in Europe. But we also want conflict and escalation up to a certain extent. I wouldn't argue for antagonism and outright war. I think that's to take it a step too far. But we want contained forms of agonistic learning. Again, this draws on the work of Chantal Mouffe. And so to conclude, I think, coming back to the theme or the topic of this workshop, to co-create, or rather to enable and develop co-creation, democracy, participation, and governance, all the good things we want, we also want the struggle, the contestation, the escalation in thinking about and practicing positive transformation. Even, which now is very much accepted, this whole air pollution thing, that the fact that it is on the agenda in places such as Flanders is the result of a year-long struggle. It was not easy at first. So it started a very small scale, activists in Antwerp. They did local measurements. They had to convince the local council that that was okay, but the council went against them. So they were up against vested interests and just people not being interested, basically. Policymakers they became interested as soon as these groups were able to mobilize more and more citizens, so that they gained a mass of people measuring air pollution. So critical mass is essential, is crucial here. So that's the key point. And then I'd just like to conclude that we need the right amount of tension. So just to reiterate what I said earlier, I'm not arguing in favor of outright war and where everything goes, or where you have people fighting each other physically. So obviously not. We want in a democracy, we want this tension between different ideals and different values. And so we also want this tension between conflict and collaboration. And that's where the interesting things happen. And so a lot of political scientists have pointed this out, Machiavelli among others. We want to keep the social fabric vital and vigorous without tearing it apart. That's it. Thank you.